There are certain silences that sound heavier than thunder. Inside the small house on Rose Hill Street, silence had become a living thing. It crawled along the walls, settled between the toys on the floor, and rested in the hollow space between breaths. It was the kind of quiet that no sound could quite reach, not even the ticking of the clock on the mantel or the steady rhythm of rain against the glass. That was the world Ella lived in now. A house once filled with music and laughter, now emptied of everything but shadows and the faint scent of her mother's lavender perfume that lingered in the curtains. Ella was 8 years old, small for her age, with eyes the pale blue of morning frost. There had once been so much life in those eyes, questions, mischief, joy, but now they looked through things rather than at them. She had not spoken since the night her parents died. Her Aunt Claire tried everything she could think of. She filled the house with the soft hum of old jazz records. She cooked pancakes that smelled of cinnamon, just the way Ella's mother had. Dee. She opened the curtains every morning and said, "Let's bring the sun in, sweetheart." But the sun never quite came in. It hovered outside the window, reluctant, as if afraid to intrude. Ella would sit at the table with her breakfast untouched, her fingers tracing invisible shapes on the wood. Sometimes she would look up suddenly, as though hearing something no one else could, but when her aunt asked, "What is it?" she would only shake her head. It wasn't that she couldn't speak. The doctors had said her voice was fine. It was that she wouldn't. Her silence was not an illness. It was a fortress. At night, when the air grew thick with the smell of rain and the whisper wind through the eaves, Ella would lie in bed clutching a small stuffed bear, its left ear missing. The bear belonged to her father, or rather, it had belonged to her father's childhood, passed down to her like an heirloom of comfort. She held it tight because it was the only thing that didn't feel temporary. Everything else in her world seemed borrowed, even the air. Her dreams came in flashes, headlights through fog, the screech of tires, her mother's scream, then nothing but darkness. When she woke, her throat always hurt from the words she never said. Claire, though gentle and patient, was growing desperate. The grief was hard enough for her. Losing her sister and brother-in-law had cracked something deep inside her, but watching Ella drift away like smoke was worse. Sometimes she would sit on the couch long after Ella had gone to bed, her hands pressed together in prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to. She prayed for a sign, for something that might pull the girl back from wherever she had gone inside herself. "Just one thing," she whispered one night, staring at the rain sliding down the window. Just one thing to make her remember how to live again. Morning came slow that day, the sky swollen with leftover clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and lilac. Ella rose before her aunt, dressed herself in a pale blue dress, and wandered out to the front yard. The world looked washed clean. Puddles reflected the sky like bits of broken mirror, and somewhere a dog barked, distant but clear. She stood at the edge of the driveway, her small figure haloed by mist. The neighborhood was waking. Sprinklers hissed across lawns, mailboxes clanged shut, and the groan of a garbage truck echoed down the street. But Ella didn't move. She just stood there, as if waiting for something unseen. Across the street, Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor, paused while watering her flowers. She had watched the girl many mornings, always silent, always still. There was something haunting about the way Ella seemed both present and absent, like a ghost that didn't know it was still alive. Mrs. Carter wanted to call out to her, to ask if she wanted a cookie, or to come inside and help feed the cats. But she didn't. The look in Ella's eyes made her stay quiet. That strange, fragile look that said the wrong word might break me. A gust of wind swept through the trees, and Ella's hair fluttered across her face. She brushed it away absently, her eyes shifting toward the hedge that ran along the side of the yard. Something moved behind it, a low sound, almost a growl but softer, like a whisper made of breath. Ella tilted her head. Another sound followed, then another, and then she saw them. 6 shapes emerged one by one from behind the hedge, stepping out of the mist as if the morning itself had conjured them. They were dogs, large, sleek, powerful. German shepherds, all of them, their coats shimmering wet in the weak light. Their eyes glowed amber, sharp yet strangely calm. They moved together, each step measured and silent, like soldiers who had long forgotten fear. Ella froze, her breath caught in her throat. She should have been afraid, but something about the way they looked at her, steady, knowing, almost human, kept her still. The biggest of them, with a white patch on his chest, took a slow step forward, his head lowered slightly, his ears relaxed. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the driveway. The child and the pack, silence meeting silence. The dogs didn't bark. They didn't move any closer. They simply sat down, forming a loose semicircle around her, their bodies still as statues. The leader let out a quiet huff, as if to say, "It's all right. We're not here to hurt you." From the kitchen window, Claire saw the scene unfold and nearly dropped her coffee. She rushed outside, calling Ella's name, but the girl didn't react. The dogs didn't move either. They just sat, eyes trained on the girl, as though waiting for her command. Claire froze at the sight, her heart hammering. She wanted to shout, to chase them away, but then she noticed something. Ella's shoulders had relaxed. The tension she carried like a second skin had softened. For the first time in months, her face wasn't blank. It was curious. Claire hesitated. Something in the air had changed, not danger, but presence. The wind had stilled, the neighborhood sounds faded, and even the rain dripping from the trees seemed to pause. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then quietly, the leader dog tilted his head and made a low, almost questioning sound. Ella's lips parted. Nothing came out, but her mouth formed a single word. Claire couldn't hear it, but she knew what it was. Hello. The spell broke a second later when the dogs rose and turned, disappearing behind the hedge as silently as they'd appeared. Claire ran to Ella and knelt beside her, grabbing her shoulders. "Sweetheart, are you all right? Did they hurt you?" Ella only blinked, her gaze fixed on the space where the dogs had been. Her fingers trembled slightly. Then, for the briefest moment, Claire thought she saw something flicker in the girl's expression. Not fear, not confusion, but something far rarer, recognition. Later, as Claire tucked her into bed, Ella clutched her bear and whispered into its ear, soundless but sincere. And though no one could hear it, if you had been close enough, you might have felt the faintest vibration in the air, like the echo of a voice long suppressed, testing its way back into the world. The next morning dawned gray and cool, the kind of morning where the clouds looked low enough to touch. Claire was up early, making tea, still uneasy from what she had seen the day before. Every time she closed her eyes, she could picture those 6 dogs, the quiet coordination in their steps, the way they surrounded Ella, like soldiers forming a wall. It had been beautiful and frightening all at once. She told herself they must have belonged to someone nearby, maybe a local trainer, maybe a farm at the edge of town. Still, something about them lingered in her mind, that strange, shared intelligence in their eyes, as if they had come with a purpose. She decided she would keep Ella inside today. No walks, no wandering, just safety. But when she turned to call her niece, she found the front door already open. Ella stood barefoot on the grass, her small figure framed in the morning mist. The same 6 dogs sat a few feet away, perfectly still, their eyes fixed on her as though they had been waiting all night. Claire froze. Her first instinct was to run, to call animal control, to grab Ella and pull her inside. But before she could move, the biggest of the dogs, the one with the white chest, rose slowly and padded toward the girl. His movements were calm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. When he reached her, he stopped, tilted his head, and sat down again. Ella didn't flinch. She extended her hand, trembling slightly, and placed it gently on his head. The dog didn't move. He just blinked once, slowly like a promise. Something shifted in that moment, a change so subtle it couldn't be measured by sound or time, only by feeling. Claire stood in the doorway, watching, unable to speak. It wasn't fear she felt now. It was awe. The girl who hadn't touched another living thing since the funeral was now sitting on the ground, surrounded by 6 enormous creatures, running her fingers through their fur, as if she had known them her whole life. One of the smaller dogs rolled onto its back, paws curled in surrender. Ella smiled. It was small, fleeting, but it was there, a tiny crack in the armor of her silence. From that day forward, The pack began to appear every morning. No one knew where they came from. Claire asked around the neighborhood, but no one claimed them. Animal control officers drove by twice, but by the time they arrived, the dogs were gone, vanishing into thin air as though swallowed by the mist. Strays, one officer said, shrugging. But no stray pack behaved like this. They were disciplined, protective, almost reverent in the way they treated the girl. They didn't beg for food, didn't bark at passing cars, didn't even chase the squirrels that darted across the lawn. They simply watched. Ella began to change. The stillness that had made her seem like a statue started to soften into quiet movement. She followed the dogs wherever they went, across the park, through the empty lot behind a grocery store, down to the little stream that curved behind the old mill road. They never led her astray, never let her wander too far. When she tripped on the path, the second largest shepherd immediately nudged her shoulder until she stood again. When she grew tired, they circled her in the grass, letting her rest with her back against the alpha's side. Claire, who followed from a distance more often than not, started to notice patterns. Each dog seemed to carry a role, a rhythm in their behavior that felt deliberate. The alpha led with quiet authority. The scarred one always stayed between Ella and the road. The youngest lingered behind her, herding gently when she slowed. The female, with a softer face and golden eyes, often sat closest when the girl was sad, resting her head on Ella's lap until the trembling stopped. It was a choreography of care, performed in silence. Claire had no explanation for it, and maybe she didn't want one. One afternoon, as sunlight dappled through maples, Claire approached them cautiously, carrying a tray of water and small bowls. "They'll need something," she murmured, setting them down. The dogs glanced at her, but made no move to drink until Ella nodded, a small, barely perceptible motion, but one the pack seemed to understand instantly. They moved as one, drinking quietly. Claire stared, stunned. "Ella," she whispered, "did you just—" But the girl said nothing. She only smiled that faint new smile and brushed her hand over the alpha's neck. From that day, the neighborhood began to notice. Children would stop their bikes at the end of the driveway, whispering about the girl and her wolves. Adults shook their heads in disbelief. "They're not dangerous?" someone asked. "No," said Mrs. Carter. "There's something else." Every evening, as the sun began to fall behind the houses, people could see them from their windows. The little girl sitting cross-legged in the grass, 6 great dogs forming a circle around her, all facing outward as if guarding against the world. As weeks passed, the air around Ella seemed to change. Her silence, once suffocating, had transformed into something peaceful. She began humming sometimes, soft, tuneless, but real. Her aunt would hear from the kitchen window and stand frozen, tears rising in her throat. One night, as Claire tucked her in, she whispered, "You seem lighter, sweetheart." Ella looked at her for a long moment, then reached for her aunt's hand and squeezed it gently. It was the first time she had touched her voluntarily in months. But there was something else, something deeper Claire couldn't ignore. Strange coincidences began to occur whenever the dogs were near. The flowers by the porch, which had stopped blooming after the accident, began to bud again. The old maple tree that had been dying sprouted new green leaves. Birds gathered on the fence when the pack arrived, chirping softly as if greeting old friends. It was as though the world responded to their presence. Not magic, exactly, but something more ancient, more connected. A harmony that had been broken was slowly being restored. Then one night, Claire woke suddenly to a sound outside, not barking, not growling, but a long, low hum of howls that rose and fell in perfect unison. She stepped to the window and saw them, standing at the edge of the yard, their heads lifted toward the moon. Ella stood with them, her small figure glowing silver under the night sky. Claire opened the door, her heart pounding. "Ella," she called softly. But before she could step forward, Ella turned, her face calm, eyes reflecting moonlight, and placed a finger to her lips, a gentle request for silence. Claire stopped. The girl raised her face again, and for the first time, Claire heard something she hadn't heard in months. Ella's voice not speaking, but humming, a soft note that joined the dog's song perfectly. weaving into their howls like thread into fabric. Claire stood there, trembling, tears spilling down her face. It wasn't just sound. It was healing. The silence that had once been her prison had become her bridge. When the song faded, the dogs lay down quietly in the grass, and Ella came to her aunt's side. "They're not afraid of the dark," she whispered. Her first words to another human since the night of the accident. Claire knelt, pulled her into her arms, and whispered back through her tears, "Neither are you anymore, my love. Neither are you." The air had been heavy all week, the kind of heaviness that presses against your skin before a storm. Clouds gathered low and slow over Rosehill Street, the sky darkening until the day itself seemed to forget what light felt like. Even the birds were quiet. Claire could feel it in her bones, that strange charge that always came before thunder. She closed the windows, brought in the laundry, and glanced toward the yard where Ella played. The girls sat on the grass, surrounded by her silent guardians. They were calm as always, too calm. The alpha lifted his head once and stared toward the horizon, ears twitching. He knew the world was about to change again. That afternoon, while Claire folded laundry in the living room, the first raindrop hit the window with a sound like a heartbeat. Then another, then a dozen. Within minutes, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming on the roof, soaking the street until the gutters overflowed. Thunder rolled across the sky, low and rumbling like some ancient creature stirring in its sleep. Claire smiled faintly. She had always loved storms, until she looked toward the yard and realized with horror that Ella wasn't inside. The front door was half open, swinging on its hinges. Her breath caught. "Ella," she called. No answer. She ran out barefoot into the rain, the cold water splashing up her legs. "Ella!" she shouted again, louder now, panic rising like the floodwater at her feet. Lightning split the clouds, and for a brief, blinding second, she saw them. 6 dark shapes moving together down the street, the girl's small figure at their center. They were headed toward the field at the edge of town, the place where Ella and the dogs often played. Claire ran after them, her hair plastered to her face, lungs burning. The wind whipped around her, tearing at her clothes, howling through the trees. When she reached the field, she stopped short. The scene before her was something out of a dream, or perhaps something far older than dreams. Ella stood beneath the great oak at the center of the field, rain streaming down her face, her dress clinging to her skin. The 6 dogs circled her, their bodies pressed close, their heads turned outward, guarding her from every direction. Lightning flashed again, illuminating them like a living sculpture, the girl and her sentinels carved in silver light. The alpha lifted his head and let out a low, vibrating sound. Not quite a bark, not quite a growl. Something deeper. The others joined him, voices rising in harmony with the storm. Claire's breath caught. It was beautiful and terrifying. She wanted to run to Ella, to drag her home, but her body wouldn't move. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding her in place. Then she saw Ella's face, not frightened, not even surprised, but peaceful. The child who had spent months trapped in silence now stood unflinching in the heart of thunder. A crack of lightning struck somewhere nearby, the sound split in the air like glass shattering. Ella flinched, covering her ears. The alpha immediately stepped closer, pressing his body against her legs, steadying her. His fur was soaked, glistening in the rain, but his eyes never left her face. Another flash, brighter this time, and the thunder that followed was deafening. The little girl screamed, not out of fear but release, a sound pulled from the deepest part of her soul. The dogs answered with a chorus of howls that swallowed the storm's roar. It was a strange, impossible moment. 7 voices, 1 human, 6 not, blending into one sound that filled the air, echoing to the trees, to the houses, to the heart of every person still awake in that sleeping town. It was a sound of grief and love, and something beyond both. Claire fell to her knees in the mud, sobbing, because for the first time she heard her niece's voice again, wild, cracked, but alive. Ella sank to her knees too, her arms wrapped around the alpha's neck, tears mixing with the rain. The storm seemed to soften around them, as if listening. The lightning drifted farther away. The thunder rolled more gently. The rain that had fallen like needles turned to mist. And in that strange stillness, Ella spoke again, her voice trembling. "Don't leave me," she whispered. The words were fragile but clear, like glass that might break if spoken too loud. The alpha answered with a low whine, pressing his forehead to hers. The others drew closer, enclosing her completely, their bodies forming a wall of warmth. Ella buried her face in fur and began to sob, real sobs, shaking her whole body, all the pain she kept locked inside pouring out in sound at last. Claire crawled forward to the wet grass, too overwhelmed to speak, too afraid to disturb what she was witnessing. When the girl finally quieted, she stayed there, her cheek resting on the alpha's neck. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the wind whispering through the grass. One by one, the dogs lowered themselves around her, heads resting on their paws, eyes half closed. The storm had passed, and in its wake lay something new. Not silence, but peace. Claire reached them at last, her heart aching with both fear and wonder. She touched Ella's shoulder lightly. The girl turned, her eyes red but bright, her lips trembling. "Andy," she said softly. Just that, one word, but it was enough to bring Claire to tears. She pulled the child into her arms, clutching her tightly. "Oh, my darling, I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here." When they walked home, the dogs followed close behind, their paws silent on the wet earth. The moon had returned, breaking through the last of clouds, and its light fell gently across the road. By the time they reached the porch, the storm was gone, replaced by the faint chirp of crickets and the distant hum of life returning. Claire turned to thank the dogs, but they were already fading into the mist, 6 shadows disappearing back into the night. Inside, Ella changed into dry clothes and curled up on the couch. Claire wrapped her in a blanket and sat beside her, not speaking, afraid that words might break the fragile magic of what had just happened. The only sound was the slow drip of rain from the gutters outside. Then Ella reached for her aunt's hand. "They came back for me," she said, eyes half closed. "When it rains, they always come." Claire stroked her hair gently. "Maybe they were always here," she murmured, "just waiting for you to listen." Ella smiled faintly. "They talked to me. What do they say, sweetheart?" The girl's eyes drifted shut, her breathing steady. "They said I wasn't alone anymore." And in that quiet, Claire realized that the silence which had once haunted their home was gone, not replaced by noise, but by something better, presence. It was the kind of quiet that holds you instead of crushing you, the kind that listens back when you breathe. Somewhere outside, the faint echo of a howl rose and faded in the distance, and the house, for the first time in a long time, finally felt alive again. Morning came slow and gentle, like a promise. The storm had washed the world clean. The streets of Rosehill glistened under a pale sun, puddles sparkling like mirrors, rooftops steaming as if sighing out the night. Inside the little house at the end of the lane, something else had changed too, something deeper than weather. The silence that had lived there for months was gone. It had been replaced by the faint hum of breath, the soft rustle of life, and the fragile sound of a little girl whispering to herself in sleep. When Claire woke that morning, she didn't move for a long time. She simply lay there listening to the world she had thought she'd lost. In the next room, she could hear Ella's steady breathing. It was strange how even that sound could feel like sunlight. She rose quietly, made coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of earth and pine. The world was still damp, the valley below veiled in mist. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a faint bark echoing across the hills, a reminder, perhaps, that the night before hadn't been a dream. When Ella came to breakfast table, her hair was tangled, her eyes heavy but alive in a way Claire hadn't seen since before the accident. She sat down without a word, picked up her spoon, and began to eat. Claire didn't want to push her. She'd learned not to. But halfway through the meal, the girl set her spoon down and looked up. "Can we go outside?" she asked. Claire almost dropped her coffee. It was such a simple question, but from Ella's lips, it felt like a miracle. "Of course," she managed to say, smiling through tears. The two of them walked down to the meadow behind the house, where the field stretched toward the forest line. The grass was still wet, bending under the weight of dew. They stood there a while, breathing in the morning. The world seemed to listen with them. Then, just as the first shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, the dogs appeared, one by one, stepping out of the trees, 6 shapes silent and certain. The alpha led them, his fur glinting gold in the light. He approached Ella with slow dignity, like a king greeting his child. Ella knelt down at once, arms open, and the dogs surrounded her. Claire watched, transfixed. The animal seemed to understand her in a way no person could, moving with her breath, responding to every flicker of her emotion. Ella spoke softly to them, her words broken but clear. "You came back," she said. The alpha wagged his tail once and pressed his head against her shoulder. She laughed, a quiet, trembling sound that felt like sunlight after endless rain. For a moment, Claire forgot the ache of the last year. There was only this, the girl, the dogs, and the valley waking around them. That day, something new began. Each morning, the dogs would appear like clockwork, waiting by the gate. Ella would run to them, speaking in small bursts of words, sometimes sentences, sometimes sounds. It wasn't always English. Sometimes it was a rhythm, a melody of breath and tone that only the dogs seemed to understand. Claire noticed how their ears perked, how they shifted closer or farther depending on what Ella said. It was as if a language was being built between them. Part sound, part silence. Neighbors began to notice. The butcher from town saw the dogs trotting beside Ella one afternoon and told others at the shop, "That kid who stopped talking? She's out there with a pack of strays like she's one of them." People laughed at first, then they saw for themselves. Every morning, without fail, the girl and her 6 companions crossed through town to the edge of the woods. They moved in perfect rhythm, never. Some said it was strange. Others said it was holy. A few whispered that maybe the dogs were spirits, the souls of her parents guarding her. But no one dared disturb them. There was something sacred in the way the pack moved, a balance you didn't want to break. Claire began to see changes too. Ella started helping in the kitchen again, humming to herself. She began drawing not people, but animals, trees, and faces that looked like the dogs. And at night, she told stories before bed. Not long stories, but tiny pieces of memory that had survived the storm inside her. "Mom liked the smell of rain," she once whispered. "Dad said I'd learn to talk to stars." Claire listened, her heart breaking and healing in equal measure. One afternoon, a social worker named Mrs. Glenn arrived for a routine visit. She was kind but practical, her clipboard always in hand. When she saw the dogs lounging outside the fence, she frowned. "They could be dangerous, Claire," she said. "You can't let a child play with wild animals." Claire shook her head. "They're not wild. They saved her." Mrs. Glenn sighed, unconvinced. "I've heard stories like that before. But grief makes us see miracles where there are none." Claire didn't argue. Instead, she called Ella from the yard. The girl ran up, cheeks flushed, the alpha trotting beside her like a shadow. Mrs. Glenn stiffened. "Ella," she said softly, crouching down, "do you like your dogs?" The girl tilted her head, studying the woman. "They're my family," she said simply. The social worker blinked. "Family?" Ella nodded. "They talk to me when nobody else can." The dog stood silently, eyes fixed on her face, as if confirming every word. Mrs. Glenn's expression softened just a little. She scribbled something on her form and rose. "Well," she said, smiling faintly, "maybe they're good therapy dogs after all." When she left, Claire exhaled. She turned to Ella. "You did so well, sweetheart." Ella just smiled and looked toward the trees. "They told me what to say." That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Claire watched her niece sitting in the yard surrounded by her pack. The air shimmered gold. The shadows stretched long. The dogs lay around her in a perfect circle, heads resting on paws, eyes half closed in peace. Ella sang softly, a song without words, only sound that rose and fell like wind through leaves. It was haunting and beautiful. Claire closed her eyes and listened. The melody felt old, older than grief, older than language. Something bore the earth itself. And in that sound, she understood what the dogs had done. They hadn't just given Ella her voice back. They had given her a new one, a voice that belonged to the wild, to everything that had once held her parents, to everything that would someday hold her too. That night, the valley was quiet again, but it wasn't empty anymore. The wind moved through the pines, and if you listened closely, you could almost hear them. 6 heartbeats and one smaller one, all in rhythm, all alive. By late summer, the valley had changed. What was once just a sleepy corner of the mountains had become a place whispered about by travelers passing through, the place where the silent girl speaks to wolves. But those who lived there knew the truth. Ella was no longer silent, and the 6 dogs who followed her were neither wolves nor pets. They were something between, wild enough to belong to the earth, gentle enough to belong to her. The days had grown long, heavy with the hum of crickets and the scent of pine sap. Each morning, Ella rose before dawn, slipped out quietly, and met the pack at the edge of the woods. Claire had stopped trying to stop her. She trusted them now, though she still watched from the porch, coffee in hand, until the girl disappeared beneath the trees. At first, the dogs only took Ella to familiar places: the meadow, the creek, the hollow stump where she liked to leave flowers. But as the weeks passed, they led her deeper. The forest began to change the farther they went. The air cooler, the light softer. There was a hush there, the kind of silence that felt alive. Every sound was sharper: the snap of a twig, the drip of water, the whisper of wings. One morning, the alpha paused a fork in the path Ella had never seen before. He turned to her, eyes bright, waiting. "This way?" she asked. He gave a small nod, not human, but clear enough. They followed the trail upward through ferns and moss, the ground soft beneath their feet. After a long climb, they reached a ridge that opened into a hidden glade. It was breathtaking, a place untouched by time. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, scattering gold dust through the air. At the center stood an enormous oak, its roots twisting out of the ground like sleeping serpents. Around it grew wildflowers in colors Ella had never seen, blues that glowed, reds that shimmered like flame. The dogs spread out silently, forming a ring around her as they always did. Ella stepped forward, her hand brushing the trunk of the oak. The bark was warm, almost pulsing. She knelt down and noticed something half buried among the roots, an old wooden pendant, weathered but intact, shaped like a small heart. Her breath caught. She knew it immediately. Her father had carved one just like it for her mother years ago. She picked it up carefully, wiping away dirt and moss. "Mom," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but the word didn't break her this time. Instead, it settled in the air like a leaf falling gently to earth. The alpha came closer and sat beside her. His eyes glimmered, not just with reflection, but with understanding. "How did you know?" she asked. He didn't move, but his tail thumped once, softly. Ella turned the pendant in her hands, feeling its grooves. The memory flooded back. Her father carving by candlelight, her mother laughing softly beside him, the scent of pine shavings filling the room. That was before the storm, before the car, before everything went quiet. She pressed the pendant to her chest and closed her eyes. In that moment, the forest seemed to breathe with her. A breeze stirred the leaves, gentle but sure. The light shifted, scattering patterns across her face. It felt as though something invisible had opened, a door between the living and the gone. She heard, faintly, a whisper, her mother's voice, not from above but from everywhere. "You've always been loved," it said. Ella gasped. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't feel broken. The dogs drew closer, their warmth grounding her. The alpha placed his head against her knee, and for a moment, she could feel her mother's hand there too, the same weight, the same comfort. When she returned home that evening, she was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the silence of loss, the silence of knowing. Claire noticed it right away. "You found something," she said. Ella nodded and opened her hand to show the pendant. "It was theirs," she whispered. Claire covered her mouth, tears welling. She remembered it too, how her sister had worn that necklace every day until the night of the accident. "Oh, Ella," she said softly, "where did you find it?" "In the forest," the girl replied. "They showed me." Claire didn't need to ask who they were. She looked toward the window, where the 6 dogs now lay in the yard, Waiting is always. Maybe it was meant for you to find, she said. That night, Ella placed a pendant by her bed. She didn't speak much, but she smiled more, that same quiet, knowing smile that seemed to come from the forest itself. When she dreamed of her parents walking with her beneath the oak, their figures dappled with sunlight, the dogs circling behind them. Days passed, and Ella began spending more time among the trees. Sometimes she brought offerings, small stones, flowers, pieces of ribbon. Sometimes she simply sat and listened. She started keeping a notebook, too, filled with sketches of paw prints, leaves, and symbols she said came from the forest language. Claire worried occasionally, but she couldn't ignore the peace that surrounded the child now. It wasn't normal, perhaps, but it was something deeper than normal. It was healing. One evening, while hanging laundry, Claire noticed something odd. The dogs, who usually slept near the porch, were standing at the tree line, staring into the woods. Their ears were up, their bodies still. Then Ella appeared, walking slowly out of the forest with the pendant hanging from her neck. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in spirit. "Auntie," she said softly, "they showed me where the forest keeps memories." Claire frowned, half smiling. "Memories?" Ella nodded. "When people go away, the forest keeps the good parts. The light, the love." She touched the pendant. "That's why it never hurts here." That night, when Claire tucked her into bed, Ella whispered something that made her pause. "They said I have to learn to help others find their voices, too." Claire brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And how will you do that?" Ella smiled faintly. "By listening, the same way they listened to me." As the moon climbed high, Claire sat by the window long after the girl had fallen asleep. The dogs were still there, stretched across the porch like silent guards. She wondered, not for the first time, what they really were, mere animals or something sent by the forest itself to mend what the world had broken. Whatever the answer, one thing was certain. The girl who once couldn't speak had found not just her voice, but her purpose, hidden among roots and rain and fur and love.